Hi, and welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberly Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. Today we're going to dive in a little deeper into the question, is critical thinking a lost art? If you missed our last program, that was part 1, and you can catch it on the upnorthmedia.org website to stream it. But today we'll continue the conversation and I think, maybe talk a little bit more about the practical application. So again, with us, our guests are Chris Kuchuris. He is the author of the book, Punctuating Our Illusions. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Mella McCormick, she is an instructor or professor over at NMC in philosophy.
Yes.
And Doug Moser, who is a counselor or therapist in the behavioral health field. So thank you, all three of you, for returning. Mella, could you start us out? You mentioned in the last program talking to your students, young students who are just freshmen in college, about their life choices and how critical thinking can make a difference in their lives. So the next question is, how do you advise them then on thinking critically? What is the first step to help them down that path?
Well, the first thing is just to introduce them to the elements of their thinking. It's just so much of our thinking we take for granted. Again, this goes back to the idea that because we're born with the ability to think, we just automatically think we're thinking well, and that's not exactly the case. So we have to break down our thinking. What are the parts of our thinking? Then what are some standards that we can use to assess that thinking? And then also, where do we want our thinking to be? Like, what's the end goal? What are we developing towards? So we have to go through the very tedious work of explaining all of that. And at first, it's incredibly overwhelming in terms of the parts and then the standards and then what we describe as intellectual virtues and intellectual vices. And it can seem just like just insurmountable in terms of understanding my thinking. And so how I explain it to my students is that it's kind of like riding your bicycle without the training wheels. So I ask them to think back to that day, if they can remember when the training wheels came off, and just the intimidation of that expectation. You want me to balance this bike, steer this bike, and pedal this bike all at the same time. Are you kidding me? Right?
Without falling.
Without falling, right?
Or running into things.
Right. That is just such an overwhelming task for a young person, for a little person, right? And no doubt there's going to be a few scratched knees, and bumps along the way. But before long, they're doing it like that, and they don't even have to consciously think about it. They're on that bike and they're going, right? And once you become familiar with the parts of your thinking, standards for assessing that thinking, and also understanding where I want my thinking to go, once you're aware of it and you practice at it, you start doing it, just like riding that bike. But it takes effort, it takes conscious effort, it does take work and practice, but it is achievable. It seems insurmountable at first, but once you become aware of it and you just get committed to it, like riding that bike, it can be done.
So you're going to walk us through those steps?
It's very lengthy. Is
there a nutshell version?
I spent 15 weeks addressing it, so I don't think that can be done in a nutshell.
Okay, well maybe we can hit on it then here.
So, Chris, I have a question for you. Mella's talking about the importance of learning to ride the intellectual bike without the training wheels. And I have found that even as I have been attempting to do that, there's certain things that will trip me up at times. And one of them that stands out is the news. I can turn on Fox or CNN or MSNBC or you name it, and I can find one panel here that says one thing, here's a panel that says another thing. I get an expert from each side. I get great video and I get sound bites. And how do you go about, in a very practical sense, with something like the news, filtering all the different voices, because they can sound very convincing. I can hear stats, I can hear great arguments, and yet I can find people that I respect a lot who end up at very different places. So is there a way to talk about the process of going through analyzing what's happening there, discarding certain things and keeping others?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question now, because not only the news, but all media sends out messages and speaks with many different voices. And it seems that particularly with television news or even newspapers, the assumption that there is one particular view that's a correct view is what people make. That if I read it in the paper, it must be factual. If I see it on TV, whatever channel it might be, that there's some element of the truth to it. And I think that that assumption itself is problematic because, like you said, people watch different channels and say, wait a minute, you said this over here, but now this person's saying this over here. How do I know? One consequence is that people just assume it's all just a matter of subjective opinion, and I'll just pick the one that I like, which many people do. They latch onto CNN or Fox or whatever it might be, and if the person is speaking the language that they want to hear, they agree with them. And if not, then they turn the channel or disagree with them or throw something at the TV or complain about it. But what I tell my students is that you have to first understand that all news media has an agenda. And the agenda is not always about just simply reporting the facts. So how do we understand what different news medias are about? Are they really just trying to inform us and give us the facts so that we're an informed citizenry and can make decisions on our own? Or are they simply trying to satisfy sponsors? Or do they have a political agenda of their own? So one way to get around that is to begin to examine multiple sources of the same story, for example. So I have them go beyond television and maybe look at some journals, maybe look at some other weekly magazines. There's one called The Week that is like a summary from a bunch of different sources of articles, and they'll give 5 or 6 or 7 opinions on what's going on in Benghazi or whatever the issue might be. Another good one is Christian Science Monitor, which has been around a very long time. It has very little to do with Christian Science religion. It's one of the most objective news sources there is. Comes out every week, and they have articles on all kind of things. And
The Nation.
The Nation.
Yeah, another very
Where'd the
So-
name come from on that? I've always been
It
curious.
came from the originator of the Christian Science Church, and part of their movement was there was an endowment to create a newspaper that spoke the truth. The truth unadorned, not the Word of God truth, just the truth as it is in the facts, so that people could make up their own minds. And that endowment has stayed, and it's funded pretty much through that. And that's their mission, and they've stuck to it pretty faithfully for a long time. So that's what I have them do, begin to look at a variety of sources, and then begin to ask, well, why do some particular media outlets speak one language only? And what do they have to gain? Is it viewership? Are they doing research to figure out what do people want to hear, and then we'll feed it back to them, because then they'll watch, and the more viewers we have, the more sponsorship we can get. And once they begin to see the mechanics of it, then they can begin to make more conscious and deliberate choices about what they're watching or reading.
I think I'm hearing 2 things. Identifying where there's a potential for bias, whether it's there's money or there's a vested interest in meeting an audience demand or furthering some type of particular agenda. And the second is trying to go back to sources, at least backtracking to either someone who has a good reputation for taking in an objective perspective on an issue, or simply trying to go back to the original journals or the places where they're getting information.
Right.
And if I could piggyback on some of that, in that the agenda might be benign or unconscious, in that a component to news media is that it has an educational background or training, and what directs that is your cultural perspective. So just to give an example, nude beaches, sunbathing, partially or fully nude. If you're in the French Riviera, it's a non-story. It's non-controversial. It's just not an issue. So that's not going to make it on the nightly news. If that same act was taking place in Lebanon, guess what? That's a news story. That's an issue. Right? So cultural perspective is so key here, and I think that's something we just take for granted. And that's going to be true of all news. So that cultural perspective that's really shaping how the news is delivered that's something that we as consumers of information have to be aware of. So like I have a few questions that I think are helpful for a person to be asking. Things like, from what perspective was this story constructed, right? Who is the intended audience? Because obviously when information is being delivered, it has an audience in mind. And oftentimes, and this can be conscious or unconscious, you're telling people things they want to hear, right? You might also ask, what information is being privileged or highlighted in this story, and what information is being ignored or negated, right? And if there is information being ignored or negated, where can I go to find that information? But there's just a series of questions one should be asking himself or herself as information is being delivered to them. And this is true no matter what culture you're a part of.
Sure.
Yeah.
Would you say with the news in particular, though, and maybe all communication we get from that square box, any of those square boxes, I know, Chris, you said this phrase, to let them make up their own minds. And I'm thinking that the trend, and maybe I'm wrong about this, though, is now I think everything we get from those boxes has some form of agenda. And I'd like to think that there was a day, or there's an ideal form of journalism that is stating facts or giving information in the most neutral way possible so that I can make up my own mind. Do you think this has been a trend to be more and more manipulated, if you will, by those sources, whether it be because they're seeking funding of sponsors and they're catering to those, or is it my imagination?
Well, considering that we're natively egocentric and then thereby sociocentric, the idea of there being a truly objective form of news telling, that might be more of just a wish than a reality. We can strive towards it, but we're constantly combating, again, that cultural perspective that we take for granted, and we often just don't even recognize is playing a very strong force in our thinking and how we tell a story, news or otherwise. So,
well, just the way they craft the headlines. I recently I was reading the news about the Supreme Court decision that was in Vermont, I want to say, about the prayer before a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And what's that?
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, thank you. And I was just comparing the headlines from the Huffington Post and Fox News and CNN, just how the headline was phrased. You know, and good for the Supreme Court, or what the heck's going on with the Supreme Court? You know, just even in the headline, the bias was so apparent. Mm-hmm. So, which one do I want to read? Well, the one I agree with. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sure is the norm now. Mm-hmm. So that's why so many outlets, you know, have certain followings, and I don't think that's a good thing in what we're talking about as far as critical thinking, right? Because a little earlier, one of you mentioned something about we like to hear what we want to hear, right? We want to be told what we want to be told. So how do we break away from that? That's what we're here to talk about, right? How do we break that? It must be a natural state that as human beings, we also want to fill in the gaps in the dark, things that we don't know or understand. We even tend to make things up to fill that in because we don't like that cognitive dissonance or that, right? I mean, just...
I remember hearing a term years ago called ego casting, the idea that now with technology we have this ability to broadcast to ourselves everything that we want, that caters to us and builds our confirmation bias, I suppose. And I guess the way you get out of that is to try to recognize I'm only broadcasting what I want to hear or what I want to be true rather than looking for places I might not normally listen to.
Right. One way to combat it, though, is through education, and in particular, teaching people how to be critical listeners, how to be critical readers. So just to give you a simple scenario, with a child reading a book, right? To have the child be able to identify what's the problem being presented in this story. Right, and I'm just thinking children's books at this point, so at a very basic level. And having the child in his or her own words be able to explain the nature of the problem. What are the complexities in it? What are the different perspectives in it? And before you even get to the end of the story, have the child decide for himself or herself, how would you solve the problem? And then when you get to the ending of the book, have them compare their ending with the ending in the book. And what would have been other possible ways for this story to end? And what about the next day, you know, in terms of the story ends happily ever after, but what about the next day, right? And what other problems could these characters encounter? That's a way at a very young age of instilling these skills into children, and then they just carry them over into other areas of their life, such as...
Seems like it would also add empathy and compassion, you know, or to encourage that, I should say, within that young child's mind, to be thinking about how would someone else handle this and why, what barriers might they have to come to the same conclusion or ending that you might be able to. Doug, I'm interested from your perspective, have you seen how this lack of critical thinking can really make someone vulnerable? I mean, it's one thing to walk around with a pretty strong bias, right? And for all of us to want our own, what did you call it? Ego casting. Ego casting. But I'm sure there's certain folks who, when they are have an inability or lack that ability, become very vulnerable. How do we help with that, or
the first
identify?
excuse me, the first example that comes to mind is one in which somebody might be stuck in some kind of polarized thinking or black and white thinking or rigid thinking, and you either love me or hate me, which could create a certain amount of stress in their life, because if they line up, too many people line up on one side, it's bad, and too many people line up on the other side, you have to kind of maintain that love. Or if I love or hate myself. So if thinking is polarized like that, it tends to put stress on the person. Today I made a mistake this morning and I hate myself. If there's an inability to accept the whole person, I both love and hate myself. So there's more. If there's an ability to be more inclusive, I find it naturally leads to more empathy and some of the intellectual virtues that were mentioned earlier. So it actually relieves a significant amount of stress.
You were talking some last week also about how for some people coming out of addictions, when they've had some type of chemical alteration in their brain or something that's happened in the way information is processed, that it hinders their ability to reason well, at least until maybe there's a time when their brain is functioning in a more healthy way. And you can correct anything I just said there that was wrong. But it sounded like there might be a time in their life where it's important they have people around them who think for them until they're able to think. And it got me to thinking, Mella, you gave the example of reading to kids. As kids' brains are developing, clearly when they're really young, you have people around them thinking for them, and then trying to help them learn how to think as they get older. Do you have any insight on how you can go about, or when it's appropriate times that we look around us and say, I might need to have somebody else be thinking for me right now, not as the end goal for my life, but just in the moment?
It brings to mind, Anthony, a saying, or it's actually a joke in one of the more traditional forms of alcohol treatment, AA, where they joke themselves amongst themselves, saying, "My best thinking got me here," meaning to AA, to arrive at the point of having an addiction. And so there's also again, back to some of the intellectual traits that Mella was referring to. AA tends to have is a strong proponent of humility, which helps people ask for help. And there is also, and this goes for, I think, all of the support groups. It doesn't matter if they're Christ-centered support groups or secular groups or spiritual-based groups. There is a significant amount of empathy and compassion and understanding just inherent when people of addiction get together and start sharing stories and want to help each other. Right. And being able to tactfully, lovingly suggest to somebody that their thinking might be erroneous is a very wonderful thing to behold in whatever way we can do that. And then it allows the person to feel more at ease to ask for help. So that's actually valued in terms of being open to feedback, which is one of the things that and I'm a relative novice to the formal critical thinking, and it seems like a lot of these, the standards, a lot of them are influenced by the spirit of scientific inquiry. So there's a real openness that seems fundamentally important. So when somebody, if I could add to that, some of the neurological information and research that we now know can help tremendously as well, to be able to explain to an addict or an alcoholic, your limbic system, your limbic circuitry got overrun by this addictive behavior that you engaged in, or with this particular substance, like an opiate, and that actually dampened the ability of the frontal cortex, which is the other brain circuit that's responsible for actual critical thinking. To actually explain that to people, they start to get it and understand, I don't just have to necessarily be humble here and practice the humility of AA. There was an actual neurological effect from one circuit's effect on the other circuit that is impairing my ability to really think rationally. So when somebody says, now my best thinking got me here, they're actually realizing that, or it's possible now through the research and reading it, that they were impaired, that their faculties were impaired to some degree.
They're actually true when they're honest when they say that.
Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah.
You know, it's interesting, Anthony, about this idea of recognizing that maybe I need help from others with my thinking right now. And to go back to my earlier point about cultural perspective, I think here in the United States, we have a very strong cultural bias towards independence. That, you know, I'm an individual and I need to take care of myself, and it's a sign of weakness to rely on others. It's a sign of weakness to ask for help. And so, you know, I think there are plenty of occasions, not just in cases of addiction or, you know, substance abuse, where we should be asking for help with our thinking. If you're just having a very stressful week, that's a good time to say, whoa, you know what, I could use some help with my thinking. But we don't live in a culture that advocates that or encourages that. And I think that's something to be seriously looked at and addressed. It's hard to have intellectual humility when really you see a lot of intellectual arrogance. And by arrogance, I mean like overly confident like in your thinking, when maybe actually you could benefit from having some help.
So part of the art of critical thinking is learning to do the self-analysis where you can see, at this moment, I'm not at my best. I should probably ask someone else to help me out in this particular issue.
Absolutely.
Well, and that does lead into what we were talking about, being vulnerable too. I mean, at least we do have some laws. I'm thinking right away about grief, in times of grief. Laws to restrict funeral homes and things to sell certain products or to ask certain questions or do certain things during that time period and things like that. So we do recognize there are times when even those of us who may feel, regularly be normal, have really vulnerable moments in our lives too. So, I think that ties into what you're saying.
Right, but again, it's interesting that our culture only gives us specific opportunities to be vulnerable when you're grieving, right? Other than that, you're on your own. Right, exactly. So I think that's a problem. I think that's a serious problem.
Seems like vulnerability and the ability to be more scientific kind of go hand in hand. So psychologist Carl Jung has a beautiful line. He talks about how most human beings are defenseless against outside attacks on their ego, and he calls them psychic infections. And he says, like your body can get an infection, you don't know you have it until you're symptomatic, and so you're vulnerable to it. Unless you know how to ward it off, keep it at bay. So if you don't want to get the flu, you wash your hands, you eat healthy, you sleep right, stay away from sick people. And so too with psychic infections, if you know how to look at where do they come from the media maybe, from someone that's trying to take advantage of you. You know, the typical stereotype of the used car salesman is going to take advantage of you. If you know what form they're coming in, if you know when they might come or when you're vulnerable, then you can at least be on guard that that might be happening. And the dilemma seems to be that we are vulnerable in such a way that we don't often look for that. So what I get my students to do is to begin to do the science of themselves. And it's an odd term, I guess, but I ask them, you know, you study things scientifically. You study nature, we study biology, we study the stars, but have you ever studied yourself? Not in the broader term of what do psychologists think about human beings, but have I ever looked and asked myself, well, why do I think this way? Why do I hold these opinions? Why do I make these assumptions? To do a basic inventory of my own thinking, because until they raise that to the conscious level and are aware that that's happening, that can't change. It's just a habit that just keeps on going.
And we can blame it all on our mothers, right?
Yep,
Isn't
yep.
that
And
am I thinking of a different?
But that's true.
Different psychologists. So we often talk about critical thinking in the sense of this is what bad thinking is, and we look for fallacies and things like that. But I think what you're pointing out is it's also important to ask the question, how is bad thinking accessing me? What are the avenues I'm allowing in my life that is distorting my ability to think well on a particular thing?
Right. And to do that in a classroom is really difficult because it can be really off-putting or seem incredibly arrogant for the teacher to get up there and say, I'm going to tell you how to think. I can think of a time when I taught a class in a prison in Nevada, and the prisoners asked me, just point blank, well, who the hell are you to tell us how to think? I mean, that was their, I'm like, okay, where's the door?
Backing up now.
But so you have to, I've found that I have to be really sensitive, because if you just walked up to someone and said, you have a problem with alcohol, they're not going to say, really, thanks, you know? They're probably going to get angry with you. You might lose a friend. So what I do in class is I try to give examples of my own thinking. Here's what I did. Here's how I made a mistake, and here were the consequences. And here's how I tried to correct it. And it's an ongoing process. I might fall down again, but you know, unlike the bike, you know, sometimes you keep falling and it takes a while to learn those things.
It sounds like humility and truth are great partners here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because it's painful to admit the truth sometimes, because your whole worldview, everything you've taken to be, you know, the foundation, the bedrock of your life, and it causes all kind of existential anxiety that we don't like.
Because we hold on to illusions, right? The title
Yeah.
of your book, Puncturing Our Illusions.
Right.
What kind of illusion? What are the most common illusions that humans hold on to? Can you speak to that a little bit? What
Yeah.
kind of thing? No.
No, I said, oh,
I said no.
there's a lot. I think that one of the illusions that we have that keeps us locked in this cycle is that we all think we can think well. We think we are reasonable and that we know how to evaluate things. And I hear it a lot from students, and I don't think they say it in an arrogant way. It's just matter of fact that I already know how to think. I don't think this can help me at all. And then it's not until we get into it for quite a while that they realize, oh, here's one of the things I do poorly. I think we have illusions about the complexities of the world. We tend to block out the realities of what's going on and the changes that are happening in our lives, so that everything's fine. You know, we don't need to worry about this problem, and it doesn't matter, you know, who the president is or what party's in power. Nothing seems to change. Many people have that attitude, although lots of things do change, some for the better, some not so. So we have illusions about those kind of things. I think we have illusions about relationships, about what counts and what doesn't count in a romantic relationship or a friendship or even a business relationship or even with your neighbors.
And social media is not helping that confusion.
No, right, yeah. What does it mean to be a good friend? That I just agree with you and tell you what you want to hear all the time, or that I'm able to be honest with you in some way?
And illusions come in the form of our beliefs, whether those be religious, political, social, you know, in terms of what is the, quote, right way to live. You know, that one becomes educated, has a career, gets married, has a family, retires, eventually dies. Like, you know, that all of these things are part of our illusions, in the sense that we base them just off of what we know, and we don't consider that there may be other perspectives or other options, or the belief that I've inherited, that I've been raised with, is the right one. Gosh, when Chris said, what are our illusions? Oh, I mean, what's not an illusion would probably be the easier question.
Well, it sounds
to
like we could
answer.
talk about critical thinking in terms of talking about what we would call brainwashing, right? Which sounds like it's the opposite, or even indoctrination. How do we fill someone's head with these illusions and they hold on to them, so dearly? How does that happen?
It happens over time. I don't think it happens, in any one instance. But one of the consequences of that is many people now have a mistrust in reason. They think that reasoning itself is not worthwhile. That everything's subjective. It's just a matter of opinion, and I'm just going to go with the one that is easiest or feels right. And I think the news media reinforces that by just giving us a very, very narrow view of the news, and by making claims like fair and balanced, all the news that's fit to print, as if any news source, even if it was totally honest, could give you the whole story. Right. That's almost impossible. No one gets the whole story. There are so many different perspectives on what's going on. We get a tiny sliver of a view, and if that sliver itself is distorted, it just makes it that much worse.
It's an interesting conundrum, I think, because when we think in a classical sense of brainwashing or some type of mental abuse, so to speak, in pigeonholing how people think, we often think in terms of a very limited stream of information that is just going directly into someone. But perhaps the accessibility of media with all the different places we can read or watch the news has created something of a cynicism. I don't know what to do with this, so I will choose, we're back to the ego casting, I will now indoctrinate myself willingly rather than having it done to me as perhaps it was done in the past.
Yeah, that's another aspect I go into with my students, trying to get them to see that ways in which we hold ideas and beliefs can be as a cynic, where you just mistrust everything, you don't believe anybody, and you become very hardened in what you do think, mistrust of many people, or the opposite, the gullible or naive person that believes everything. And both of those people can be taken advantage of. The gullible because you can tell them anything and they go with it, and the cynic because even though the cynic might seem to be not vulnerable to being told what to believe, you can just speak to what they believe to. It's just tell them what they want to hear, and they tend to go along with you. So they are, if they have a particular belief and you know what that is, you can be a talk show host and just speak to that issue and have a large audience to perpetuate what you want to do.
And once they're in that rigid form of thinking, any other views, no matter how trustworthy or pertaining to the truth they offer, that person's not going to acknowledge it or let it in.
No. So I try to get them to see then that there's middle ground to that, the skeptic. The healthy skeptic who asks questions, that doesn't take things on face value, especially those that line up with their own views. That's a sign that if that's happening, maybe that's my most vulnerable state. So for example, I've been, in my mind, complaining about all the potholes around town, as many people have, as I'm trying to dodge them. And one of the conclusions I came to is, I don't know what's going on with the city, the county, or whoever's in charge of this, but why aren't they addressing this problem? They must be lazy or incompetent or what's going on? And then I read in the paper yesterday that there are several reasons why they haven't been doing that are legitimate reasons, that the rain has washed it out, it's too cold, the asphalt plant hasn't opened up yet, so they can't get the product. So like, oh, okay, maybe I overreacted a little bit there. But we all do that, so.
Do you think sometimes we don't trust our gut? I've found that in so many different aspects of life, especially interactions with young people, that we're almost culturally taught that it's more important to be polite, it's more important, those kinds of things. And so we have a gut reaction to something and suppress it immediately. I know I talked about this on a show in the past, and maybe it was our show last, about self-defense, with young women, and that kind of that, oh, I shouldn't say no, or get myself out of this situation, and they kind of override it.
Like a squelching of intuition.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if, again, I know you're going to answer and say it's education, but maybe in more detail, how can we teach each other, ourselves, to listen more to that voice and be responsive to it? And I think it happens automatically. And I have an example. I got a call last week, and I'm an author, and I have a novel out, and it was a company that was trying to get me to buy their services. Of course, they didn't say that right out, and they were pushing all the buttons. Oh, we saw your book on Amazon, and thought it had so much potential, and we read it cover to cover, and and for me the alarm bells are going off, and I'm thinking, no, you didn't. Like you didn't invest all that time just before you called me out of the blue, kind of thing. But it made me think, how many authors fall for this? Because they want that so badly, for someone to recognize their work, for someone to, So how do we help people to trust that, or even have that? Maybe a lot don't even have that bell, that alarm going off. I don't know.
Well, and I would say, again, it's education, but maybe not in the way that you're thinking. It's being educated about the cultural bias. So to go back to your example about the self-defense, being educated of how my culture has influenced me to think I need to be ladylike. So what my culture is teaching me may not be in my best interest. And so going with my intuition would be the right thing to do. But I can't do that until I'm first aware of how I've been culturally reared to think or behave versus what would be in my best interest. What my culture's teaching me isn't always in my best interest. It might be in the culture's best interest, but that's not mine. So it's having that level of awareness of what is intuition telling me versus what my culture's been preaching or teaching to me. So it's not the education of what culture says I should be doing, it's being aware of the two different messages and recognizing which benefits me more, my intuition or what the cultural training.
So do you feel that the intuitional or emotional side of who we are, as it interacts with the rational or intellectual side of who we are, do you see one of them as providing the guide rails for the other, or do you see those two things as working in tandem? And that's for any of you.
In tandem.
Yeah, okay. I think that they go together, because if you think about what those two traits function as, every circumstance we enter into, like our discussion right now, has an emotional aspect to it, the potential for pleasure or pain, and somewhere on that spectrum, an extremely painful death or all the way to the joyous, elated part. But every situation we enter into has that potential, and we always try to gauge what that is. So I give my students the example, when they walk into class, if you're one of the last people in class, you have to decide, where am I going to sit? Something very simple like that. And I see people all the time making a choice. I don't want to sit next to that person. They don't say it, but you can tell. No, not there. No, not, okay, here, or as far away from someone as possible. So they're gauging, well, how will this feel to me? And we can gauge that correctly or incorrectly. So sometimes our assessment of the emotional aspect of the circumstance is incorrect. We overestimate or underestimate the potential for pain. And if we do that, we can't manage the circumstance well. We will make mistakes. Same thing with the rational part of any circumstance. What's really going on? What's the reality? Sometimes we view something and see things that aren't there, that's not really part of the reality. Or sometimes we don't see what's really there. And so how we manage the circumstance, both emotionally and rationally, has everything to do with the outcome of how we can be successful at what we hope to accomplish there.
I'm not particularly fond of the whole right brain, left brain theory, in terms of, the right brain being the creative, artistic, more open-minded part, and the left brain is that analytical, logic-based thinking. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy, and I do think they work in tandem with one another. And whether we're talking about creative thinking or emotional thinking, there's always some form of evaluating and assessing going on. And so that's the rational, critical thinking part of it. Like, just to give you an example in terms of artistic thinking. So if you've ever noticed a painter, so they're making their artistic expressions with the paintbrush, but then they step back and they look at it. That's the critical thinking part. That's the assessment. And then they creatively express themselves again, and they step back and they assess it. So they work hand in glove. I mean, they're not separate. You're doing both at the same time. I mean, dancers often practice in front of a mirror. They have a creative idea or image in their mind, and they're trying to bring it, to some sort of external expression, and they have that mirror to use to critically assess and judge themselves. So I'm just not in favor of this wanting to dissect our thinking in that way and put them in different camps, because I think they're just so interconnected and interrelated.
Are we driven, though, as human beings by our desires first and foremost to be happy, to be to feel good? I mean, is that what addiction is, really? Those who are most vulnerable to addiction, are they people who are most driven to seek some kind of, whether it's physical or some kind of satisfaction there, or pleasure, I guess is more the word?
This is a whole subject that could be looked at critically, I'm sure, but the whole evolution of the brain in terms of, and there might be a sequence here in terms of reptilian responses, which comes from the brain stem that just keeps us alive, and more mammalian response of the limbic brain, which evolved after that, which sits more in the middle of the cranium, which has to do with more with feeling rewards for certain behaviors that carry our species forward. And then the more primate brain, which is what we are to be noted for, upper primates, the ability of the forebrain to rationalize and step back and get perspective. So it's interesting to watch those three, or be aware of those three and how they function. And Mella gave an example. So there might be there might be a sequence in certain cases where someone's just artistically creating a painting or playing notes on an instrument, just feeling like, I want to go there and play this little riff. But a lot of musicians will at some point record themselves or listen to the tape and be more critical, stand back and apply that perspective to it, or when buying an instrument or paint supplies to be more critical. So I think critical thinking is something that's really applied to certain specific situations, and it's not meant, I don't think, to necessarily pick apart or reduce emotional or artistic or intuitive forces, but to add to that part of life the ability to step back and get perspective and critically think about that.
Doug, I think of 4 different ways that people could journey toward health if they're struggling with some type of behavior or addiction difficulty that they're coming to see someone like you about. And there's probably more than 4, but these 4 strike me: that there's an intellectual, an emotional, a relational or a community or a spiritual component that people will pursue. Have you found in your experience that one of those stands out as a way that seems to be a more certain path toward health, or is it unique to the individual that certain things click with some? In other words, are there general patterns, or is it almost always specific?
I would say it's unique. My experience is it's unique to the individual. My bias is I'm trained in healthcare, so I'm very much trained to treat the individual. And some individuals have more problems with the cognitive functioning. It could be a head injury. It could be hypofrontality that develops from a severe addiction. Other individuals, and I would clarify the spiritual piece. One of the things that comes up when looking at health, particularly addiction, is to look at the language and what does language mean and what do words mean. And there was a quote on one of some of the questions you asked us to give it a thought in terms of words relating to our world. And spirituality is one of those words. It's like treatment or recovery or depression or anxiety. I have been viewing it more as there's an inspirational, motivational component to all of us. It may be manifested in some individuals as spirituality. In the secular world, there are some people in the secular world that may not feel or take themselves to be spiritual in any way. They're very inspired, however, more by science or nature or art. And there are some people in the religious world where their spirituality actually manifests in a more concrete religious form. So what you say is very true. I would just substitute the word inspiration or motivation for that last one, and watch that and see, again, towards helping someone towards health is to see do they have things that are inspiring them that they've lost touch with? What's their intellectual or cognitive capacity? What's their psychological capacity? And what's their physiology doing? How's their thyroid?
There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about a word choice that has been bothering me in this whole conversation that came up earlier, and that is, I think, associating the idea of critical thinking with logical thinking, or logical or analytical thinking. And the reason I think it's bugging me is I'm a creative person. I'm an artist, definitely could be labeled right brain, even though that might not be the correct. And I think in terms of, I think visually, and I think when I am attacking something, an artistic endeavor, and get into what I would call flow, that place where we're not thinking about thinking, but we're there, we're completely there in a creative endeavor. I compare that to a person that I know very well, and that's my husband. And he is an engineer. He is a logical, analytical thinker. He approaches things very, very differently. And he would find flow, I would think, in something more, like he likes to do puzzles, like a Sudoku puzzle. I've done one, I did it, I figured out how to do it, and now I'm bored. But to him, I think it's an enjoyable process because it's logical, maybe, right? I mean, I can't be in his head. But yet, I'd like to think that I understand the concept of critical thinking and that I can think critically. So I don't necessarily think it's almost fair to say that those go hand in hand. Can you straighten me out a little bit, or why you would say critical thinking is more logical, analytical, or even that process where I believe that I can think more critically because of some of the other things you're talking about, perhaps having more humility in the approach and understanding motivation of, the person giving you information, that kind of thing. Can you clarify that a little bit for me? Any of you?
As probably the amateur on the panel or a latecomer to formal critical thinking, I have been very impressed with what Mella referred to as the standards, and I look at them as skills, and there's 10 of them, and I think they're really valuable to have, to learn about and to notice. And I could just read them very quickly so the audience might at least understand some of the components. And logic and reasoning is just one of the 10. So here they are: clarity, accuracy, and precision, which I lump closely together, but those are 2 and 3. Relevance and significance, logicalness, completeness, fairness, breadth, and depth. So it's and again, in my novice pursuit of this, there's embellishments of all of these that are fascinating to delve into, just the chapter on logical and thinking, all the different types of thinking. But there's all these others too that really play in to make it, to me, a very complete way of viewing something. These skills can be applied to almost anything. Thinking itself, or like I said, buying an instrument, or claims, medical claims, psychological theories, which one is going to work, which one, treatment for addiction, which ones work, and so these are fascinating approaches. And so I don't necessarily view logic and rational as I find it embedded in these other 9.
Right, it's just one of many components to critical thinking. Critical thinking isn't just the logicalness part. But I think where the false dichotomy often arises is that we tend to undermine or underplay thinking itself as a creative act. You're creating, it's intellectual inventiveness. So the idea that you can separate creativity from thinking itself is creative, right? But the critical thinking part is that I'm going to step back and assess this creativity, this thinking, with values, with standards of value. So I'm not just going to do it willy-nilly or subjectively. No, I'm going to have these very concrete criteria that I'm going to assess this thinking with, whether it's creative thinking, emotional thinking, etc. So, but thinking itself is a creative process. So
I think there's a bias in our culture, though, to look at people in general who are more analytical or logical thinkers, or maybe the way they go about things, and assume that they're better critical thinkers. I mean, I know that there's the study about the 7 intelligences. Mm-hmm. Help me out here. Who was that?
Gardner?
Yeah, that sounds right. But that in our public school system, in the way that we educate our students, that logical and analytical thinking is what we value and what we, you get an A if you think that way, and that's the way we test. And there's 5 other levels of intelligence or ways of being intelligent that we don't value as much.
I think we do
I don't know
value
if I
them.
list those, but
I don't have children, so but maybe people that have children actually see how that manifests in elementary school or high school. But I think we value, at least my take on it, we do value the dramatic arts, and particularly the 2 high schools here that have. We value athletics and physical intelligence. We also value arts, music. At least in this community, they seem to be very, very heralded.
I don't know if we do culturally in the big picture, though.
Right.
We certainly don't monetarily. We don't value. I mean, you've heard the starving artist. We don't look at the arts in those terms of something that we value as a person who. I mean, if you did have a son or daughter and they said, "I want to be an artist," there's probably a very big chance that you and your spouse would maybe try to talk that person out of going into the arts as a profession. And there's a whole big picture cultural reason for that.
On the other hand, if our kids said to us, I'm thinking about being a mathematician or a philosopher, I think that's also can be daunting to find fields that can be lucrative. On the other hand, I'm watching the award show on TV last night. You can make a lot of money in music.
Very
there's
few
probably
people can make a lot of money in music, and all the rest make very little money.
Like a feast or famine kind of thing, maybe on the ends of the two.
Yeah, the idea of celebrity is such a long shot.
Well, and when you think about school districts, when they're experiencing financial distress, what are the first programs that get cut? Right. It's often the creative ones. Right. It's the theater, and it's the music, and it's the art.
Because it seems like we started our conversation on the last show with this very topic, which was how culturally, here in the U.S. anyway, or in the West, we value a profession, right? Everything that we do is guided toward a profession instead of, our avocation, or, just being a
good person, you know, as a value, right? So we've kind of come full circle in our conversation, it feels like.
Do we live to work or do we work to
To
live?
live, yeah, exactly.
And there's
how do we value this?
You know, one of the standards is completeness and thoroughness. So again, for someone who's a bit of a novice to more formal critical thinking, to just even apply it to our discussion about societal values, to be complete is possibly to see that I can do my vocation from 9 to 5 and earn my living, and do my avocation afterwards. And I think some of us here are musicians, and there's a certain practicality to understanding. It's not one or the other. It's how to do that, how to live fully in that respect, in a practical way, in a world that may have different values than the values I have. I might value music over what I do for a living, but I'll find a way to do it. Right. And express myself artistically.
And I don't think it's intentional in our culture. It's probably the nature of, well, what puts food on the table, right? That kind of thing. But at the concert most of us were at, right, this weekend concert, I remember the subject came up that tickets were, I think, $20, and that's because they had some sponsors and some things, because otherwise they'd have to charge $40 or $45 and no one would come because they wouldn't pay that for that art, for that experience. So I think that there's a lot of truth in that.
But even in the West, there's differences between the way cultures look at work and everything else. So we could, for example, it's not in the news now, but it had been for quite a while, the crisis in both Italy and in Greece, the monetary crisis, and how they're angry with the Germans because the Germans are very much logical and figured out the money and can't understand why the Greeks in particular won't solve their problems. Why are they willing to live in debt? Why have they spent all this money? And the Greek view is that I don't live my life to work. I live my life to enjoy my life, and work is secondary. And so if someone has a birthday party and it's Tuesday, you have the party Tuesday. You don't wait till the weekend. And if you stay out till 2 a.m. at the party and you can't go to work tomorrow, the boss is okay with that because he's probably doing the same thing. Or she's. So it's a totally different sense of values and time. But on the world stage, we get two different views of that. Which one, do we look at those people as lazy? Or shiftless or something like that, and that the other view is the one that's more logical and more practical and therefore better, or how do we see those things?
It sounds like a lot of what we've been talking about overall, that our cultural values, a lot of that is what causes some of our critical thinking issues.
Right.
Unfortunately, we kind of run out of time.
Yep.
I thank you again for joining us and for having this discussion. It feels to me like we could do another hour, but I think we need to wrap it up. We're all enjoying the conversation. All right, we're out of here. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you at home for joining us at In Focus.